Dear students of Kyiv-Mogila Academy, welcome to your first lecture. Today we have the privilege of hearing from the truly outstanding speaker. It's my honor to introduce Ambassador Wільям Тейлор, an American diplomat, government official, former military officer, and now an honorary professor of the National University of Kyiv-Mogila Academy. Ambassador Teylor currently serves as a distinguished fellow with the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and has previously been vice president for Europe and Russia at the US Institute of Peace. From 2006 to 2009, Ambassador Teylor served as a United States ambassador to Ukraine and again at the US Embassy in Kyiv from 2019 to 2020. His career of service extends far beyond Ukraine. He is a decorated veteran of the Vietnam War, having earned the Bronze Star and Air Medal with a V device for valor. After military service, he brought his experience to the US Department of Energy and the Department of Defense. As a diplomat, Ambassador Teylor has represented the United States across Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, Afghanistan, Iraq, and in the Middle East. His distinguished academic background includes a Bachelor of Science from the United States Military Academy at West Point and Master of Public Policy from Harvard University's John Kennedy School of Government. On February 27, 2025, the Academic Council of the National University of Kyiv-Mogila Academy conferred upon Wільям Тейлор the title of Honorary Professor of Kyiv-Mogila Academy. Today, we are privileged to hear his inaugural lecture entitled A Message to Ukrainians. Ambassador Teylor, the floor is yours.
President Kavit, thank you very much for that introduction. Students of Kyiv-Mogila Academy, thank you for having me. I am honored to be here. I'm delighted to be here. As the President said, I have spent some time here in Ukraine. Some of the best years of my life here in Ukraine. I lived 2 times in a residence, in a house, about 200 meters from here. Had the opportunity to walk through your campus, spoke a couple of times here at Kyiv-Mogila. It's great to be back on your campus. I feel very comfortable. I feel now welcome here as an honorary professor here on your campus, even in the middle of this horrible war that all Ukrainians and indeed the whole world is living through. My experience and history with Ukraine is about the same length as your history of Ukraine. I've been here about the same number of years that you've been here. And so it's an honor to be able to speak to you here today. I would like to talk with you about my thoughts on Ukraine, based on my time here and my time kind of studying Ukraine and acting here in Ukraine. But more importantly, about the thoughts and the attitudes, the feelings of Americans about Ukraine, and how those feelings and thoughts have evolved over the last 20 years of your life and of my experience with Ukraine. And then some thoughts, of course, about Putin's war on your country. Today, you are 1,286 days into the worst fighting in Europe since World War II. And that's not counting the time since Russia's initial invasion in 2014. In 2022, Americans know that you repelled the Russian invader's massive attack, pushed him back, for the last 2 years have fought the Russians to a standstill. Yes, he is grinding out on the battlefield. He is grinding out a meter, a kilometer, a village where Ukrainians live, a crossroads, making small progress, Russians are, at great cost to the Russian, great cost to Ukrainians. But he is not making significant gains. Putin is not making significant gains in your country because of your army. In 2023, Russia illegally occupied 18% of your country. 2 years later, at great cost, Putin occupies 19% of your country. So 1% over 2 years. He is not winning. Russia is not winning this war. You have earned the respect and admiration of the entire Western world. Europeans know you are defending them against Russia. Americans know that you're defending Western values, and you're fighting one of our two main enemies. Americans see how you have resisted the Russians, and we support you in your fight. We have seen how you innovate, how you improvise, how you resist, how you suffer, how you endure, how you defend your country and your values. We, Americans, haven't had to fight to defend our country and our values since World War II. You are an example to Western democracies around the world. You inspire us. Let me tell you why Americans support you in this terrible war. Over the past 3.5 years, I've spoken to thousands of Americans around my country. I've spoken to universities, I've spoken to community colleges, I've spoken to Ivy League universities, to small towns, big towns, people who are Americans who are interested in foreign policy. I've spoken in person, I've spoken on the radio and TV, on Zoom. Americans are very interested in what's going on here in Ukraine. So I've had the opportunity, as someone who has both served here twice, have been here many times. Indeed, this is my 11th visit since the big war started in 2022. And Americans are interested. Americans want to hear about what you're going through, what you're fighting for, why you're fighting, how you're fighting. They want to know how Americans can help. Some want to know why we are fighting, why Americans are supporting Ukraine. And that's why I take the opportunity every time that I get the invitation in the United States to go to Alaska, to go to Alabama, to go to New Hampshire, to go all over the country when invited to talk about Ukraine. And Ukrainians are inspiring Americans. Americans want to understand what's going on there. By the way, when I talk to Americans in these meetings, sessions around the country, around my country, I will usually start off with some remarks to give Americans who are there in the audience some sense of background, of in Ukraine. Very soon, they want to engage. They want to ask questions. They want to challenge me in some of these conversations. I look forward to that opportunity with you here today. I'll give my remarks, but I very much would like to hear your thoughts, your questions after my remarks, and so I look forward to that part of this morning. In those discussions around my country, Americans they express 4 reasons that I hear from them about why the United States should support Ukraine, why it's in our interest, why the Americans should feel like we have a stake in what happens in Ukraine. The first reason, and the one expressed most passionately by Americans, is a sense of moral outrage. Americans understand that it's wrong for one country to invade another country. It's wrong for one country to try to take territory, land, people from another country. People in the United States understand the moral depravity of the Russians. They understand and are horrified by the atrocities. Americans understand they know that it's wrong to capture children and take them back into Russia. It's wrong to torture people. It's wrong to kill civilians, to target civilians. Americans feel that viscerally. Indeed, I believe that it was that moral sense that finally got to President Trump and finally convinced him that President Putin, responsible for these moral outrages, was the problem. So this is the first reason. In that same vein, Americans demand accountability for these war crimes, these crimes against humanity. Many Americans and many Europeans and many around the world call it genocide. Many Americans support international efforts to establish a war crimes tribunal, an international court to hold Putin and his officials accountable for their crime of aggression against Ukraine. Americans are sure that if no one is held accountable for these crimes, they will happen again. That's the first reason that Americans support you. Some Americans support you for geopolitical reasons. Russia's attacks on Ukraine since 2014 and in 2022 violate the norms and the principles, the treaties, commitments that all nations had made to one another since World War II, including the Soviets, including the Russians. These norms and commitments had provided the framework within which nations dealt with one another. This framework, this order, obliged all nations to respect the sovereignty of all other nations, to respect internationally recognized borders, and to resolve disputes peacefully. Some Americans, but not enough, I will say, remember that in 1994, Ukraine gave up the third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world in exchange for a guarantee that their sovereignty and territorial integrity would be respected, assured. The Budapest Memorandum was signed by, as every Ukrainian knows, United States, Great Britain, Ukraine, and Russia. It was an important part of this international order that I mentioned. That commitment, like all other treaties the Soviet Union and Russia signed, was grossly violated in 2014 and most violently in 2022. Ukrainians will not accept weak security guarantees again. It was that erosion of the international order that was the subject of a book written by the American scholar Robert Kagan, which was titled The Jungle Grows Back. The Jungle Grows Back. Kagan describes the period in history between 1945 and 2014 as a small garden in the long history of the lawless jungle of international relations. In that short window between 1945 and 2014, world economies grew, freedoms expanded, major wars were avoided. Of course, there were conflicts during that time. Korea, Vietnam, Yugoslavia, others. But there was no Third World War, no small achievement. But gardens, as Ukrainians know well, require work. Maintaining post-war institutions like the United Nations, World Trade Organization, NATO, World Bank, IMF, others, punishing violations of sovereignty, like an international coalition did when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. A garden needs to be tended, weeds pulled, vines chopped, or the jungle will grow back. If Russia gets away with invading its neighbor, annexing territory, subjugating citizens of another country, yours, then the order that kept the peace among great powers in Europe since 1945 will be severely damaged or destroyed. If we want to restore some version of that post-war order, Russia must lose. Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity must be restored. A third reason that Americans tell me in these sessions that I have around the country that they support Ukraine is security. Security for Europe, for the United States, and for American soldiers. If Russia were to succeed in Ukraine, Putin would not stop there. He would threaten NATO allies and all of Europe. Americans don't understand Russia as well as Europeans do. I listen to the Finns, the Estonians, the Poles, and you Ukrainians, people who have lived next to Russia for generations. You understand Russia much more than Americans do. And you have taught most of us Americans that Russia is a persistent threat to all its neighbors. It's been that persistent threat for centuries. This is what we were instructed here, this alert. Are we okay?
Товариство, перериваємо нашу лекцію. Прошу вас пройти в укриття в бізнес-центр Іллінський. Після повітряної тривоги повертайтеся до зали. Робимо перерву.
Is an indication, is a demonstration, an example of the discipline, of the resilience that I was talking about in my book. So you just go, no panic, quick movement into shelters, recognition that the threat was past, come back in and resume what you would do. Again, I'm very impressed with the great. When the Russians interrupted us, I was talking about why Americans support Ukraine. And I get described two reasons.
One was just a moral reason, a moral outrage at what Russia is doing to your country. And the second is a more geopolitical reason for that some Americans support you for. They want to see a restoration of some order in the international world where rules of sovereignty, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity are observed. And it's important for Ukraine to win, prevail, in order to reestablish that order. And I was about to say that the third reason that Americans support you is because we care about our own security, European security, as well as Ukrainian security. If Russia were to succeed in Ukraine, they wouldn't stop. They would continue to go on. And I was just mentioning that I listened to Europeans. I listened to Ukrainians, to Finns, to Poles, to Estonians, who have lived next to Russia. This is what I was saying as this is a demonstration, have lived next to Russia and understand Russia better than Americans, because you live next to them. And the Poles live next to them, and the Finns live next to the Russians, and you understand them better than we do. When European leaders, including President Zelensky, I put President Zelensky in that same category of European leaders, when they came to Washington last month, they emphasized, Europeans, leaders emphasize how important it is for Ukraine to win, for Ukraine to prevail, to have the support. And those Europeans demonstrated that stopping Russia in Ukraine is a European imperative, and thus it is an American imperative. Europe, including Ukraine, is a vital strategic interest for the United States, for all the reasons that we all know, economic, security, cultural, historical reasons. It's a vital interest for the United States. And Russia is the most immediate threat to Europe and to US security. For that reason, after World War II, we established NATO to defend Europe and the United States from the Soviet Union, and in the first instance, and then the Russians later, by being strong enough to deter any attack from the Soviet Union and now Russia, but if attacked, to fight and defeat it. That's what NATO does. That's what NATO is. We've stationed our soldiers in Europe to demonstrate our commitment to that alliance. Most immediately, American soldiers helped deter Russia on NATO's eastern flank. Those soldiers, their families back in the United States, and most Americans want you to succeed in stopping Russia from advancing further west. So we provide weapons and money to that effect. Fourth reason that Americans support Ukraine: China. China. Many Americans, I will tell you, many Americans see China as our biggest threat, as the biggest threat to the United States. I actually disagree with most Americans on that. It's pretty clear to me that the biggest threat to the United States and to international security is Russia, not China. I mean, China is big, China is growing, China is making advances, but Russians are killing people. Russians are killing Ukrainians. Russians are the biggest threat. Even those Americans who think that China is the biggest threat support Ukraine. They know that President Xi is watching how the West supports Ukraine. President Xi is figuring that if we don't support Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression, we might not support Taiwan in the face of a Chinese move on that island. By the way, some of the strongest supporters of Ukraine in the international community are Japan, and South Korea, and Australia, and the Philippines. They know that our support for Ukraine is a strong deterrent against China. So those are the four reasons that I hear from Americans. Anger and outrage at Russian atrocities, a hope that your success can restore an international order that keeps international peace, concern that Russian advances directly threaten U.S. soldiers, and concern that Russia's success could encourage China. Those are the four reasons that I hear when I talk. Those are the views of Americans today as you defend yourself from Russian aggression, but Americans haven't always paid that much of attention to Ukraine. When I arrived here in 2006, Ukrainians were still basking in the afterglow of the Orange Revolution. Viktor Yushchenko was president. Expectations were high. Europe beckoned. But Ukraine was not united. A pro-Russian president was in Bankova, but a significant number of Ukrainians still sought to align with Russia in 2006 when I arrived. Indeed, when I got here, the second largest political party in the country, Party of Regions, was unabashedly, they were not embarrassed to say they were pro-Russian. They opposed NATO membership for Ukraine. They wanted Ukraine to join Eurasian, not European, economic and security organizations. So there was a divide in Ukraine that Americans saw. Europeans too. Europeans were skeptical of Ukrainian commitment to the West in 2006. The Europeans blocked your first attempt to join NATO. We have to remember, you should remember, that it was an American president who in 2008 pushed very hard to get you started on a path to NATO. President George W. Bush, who had sent me to Kyiv in 2006, stopped here in Kyiv on his way to a NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008, where the question of NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia was on the agenda. He came here to Kyiv because he wanted to be able to convince European leaders when he got to Bucharest that NATO should approve Ukraine's application. The Germans and the French said no. Ironically, today, most European nations support Ukraine in NATO, and it's the US government and a couple of other Europeans that now oppose, at least for now, Ukraine's joining NATO. Let me ask you an interesting question. If in 2008, George W. Bush, President Bush, had been able to convince the Germans and the French to allow Ukraine to join NATO, to begin the path to join NATO, would Putin have invaded Ukraine in 2014 and again in 2022? It's an interesting question. We'll never know, but it's an interesting question. But we believed, Americans believed, and still believe, that a free, democratic, market-oriented, secure Ukraine was vitally important to the United States and to our allies in Europe. And we're willing to support your development of Western democratic security and economic institutions. We supported your application to join NATO, and for what it was worth, for the European Union. At the embassy, we clearly understood that Ukrainians, and only Ukrainians, would decide your path. You would decide European or Eurasian values. You would decide democracy or autocracy. You would decide individual freedom or nationalist ideology. These were and are your decisions to make, not ours, no one else's. If, however, you chose Western values, democracy, and individual freedom, we would be there to help. The revolution of dignity confirmed your decisions. Europe was your destination. You made progress toward that goal during Petro Poroshenko's presidency, even as the Russians occupied Crimea and Donbass and fomented and fought a conflict that took 14,000 Ukrainian lives. In 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky vowed to end that war and fight corruption, and Ukrainians elected him in a landslide. I arrived back in Kyiv as the new president was inaugurated and watched him grapple, in that first 6 months that I was here, 7 months, grapple with both challenges, Russians and corrupt oligarchs. President Zelensky initially thought that he could end the war with a face-to-face meeting with Putin. He soon concluded that that wouldn't work. Similarly, 5 years later, President Trump thought he could end the war in 24 hours. Until last month, he had concluded that won't work. Now, a meeting between President Zelensky and President Putin is being discussed again, possibly followed by a three-way meeting adding President Trump. Hopes, however, are not high. Putin shows no sign of joining such a meeting. In my observation, Russia's full-scale invasion in February of 2022 finally united Ukrainians once and for all. The divisions I had seen in 2006 were gone. The whole world watched in awe as you defended yourselves, your army stopping the Russians on the outskirts of Kyiv and pushing them back towards where they come from. Your president staying in Kyiv and asking for ammunition, not a ride, when your soldiers drove the Russians out of Bucha and other cities and discovered the terrible crimes that Russian soldiers had committed against Ukrainians, the civilized world was horrified. When you sank the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, we all cheered. The response of Ukrainian defenders on Snake Island to the Russian warship's demand that they surrender ricocheted around the world. Your security services' audacious drone strike on Russian airfields and bombers thousands of miles from Ukraine earlier this summer was hailed as a triumph of Ukrainian ingenuity and skill. At unbearable cost in Ukrainian lives, you have held off the Russian invasion. Americans support you and fly Ukrainian flags in solidarity. Like you, we want this war to end in a just and lasting peace. Your defense of Western values and your skill and determination on the battlefield further enhanced your reputation among other Europeans and Americans. The European Union put Ukraine on an accelerated track toward EU membership. Some Europeans even see that process culminating in your joining the European Union in 5 years. Even the recent controversy about the independence of your anti-corruption agencies, and I know a lot of people in this room participated in those demonstrations, but even that has not done significant damage to the support from Europe and from the United States, thanks to President Zelensky's reversal. The ingenuity of your defense industries from basements to factories has generated joint ventures with US and European defense firms to the great benefit of both sides. Europeans have emerged as the strongest supporters of Ukraine. In 2014, we Americans led the effort to impose sanctions on Russians for their aggression, and Europe eventually followed. Now Europe leads that effort, putting more sanctions on more banks, lowering the price cap on Russian crude oil, cracking down on evasions of the international sanctions regime. European nations are dramatically expanding the resources that they devote to defense. And that includes military support for Ukraine. In a reversal, Europeans now provide more support than my country. They are sending weapons to Ukraine from their existing inventories and purchasing replacements from U.S. defense suppliers. European nations now also lead the efforts to establish a reassurance force to be deployed in Ukraine to deter another Russian invasion when the firing stops. Led by the British and the French, a group of European nations is planning a coalition of the willing to pool armed military forces with backup support from the United States to be based on Ukrainian territory in support of Ukrainian military forces. This would be a real security guarantee that could deter the Russians from invading again. You are European. Your fellow Europeans are leading the international effort to support you. The last part of my conversation before I look forward to your questions and our conversation about how this war might end. And the elements of how this war might end might now be coming into view. First, there must be a ceasefire. An armistice, call it what you will. Ceasefire, armistice, truce, a pause, but the killing must stop. Months ago, President Trump and President Zelensky agreed on a 30-day ceasefire on land, in the air, and on the sea. President Trump made the proposal to Putin. The Russians said no. That Putin is the obstacle to a ceasefire and an end to this war has now become clear to President Trump. Moral outrage over nightly attacks on civilians played a role in his change of mind. In order to pressure Putin to the negotiating table, President Trump in July resumed supplying U.S. weapons to Ukraine through NATO allies. This was a strong signal to Putin that he can't wait us out. President Trump seemed to waver in Anchorage last month, but Putin's brutality, I am convinced, will convince President Trump that Putin is not serious about ending this war on Ukraine. European leaders, including President Zelensky, seem to have steadied President Trump in support of an armistice. President Trump had also vowed to put more and harsher sanctions on Russia in order to force Putin to come to the negotiating table. And he was going to put sanctions on any nation that bought Russian oil. He followed through on that threat. President Trump followed through on those tariffs, putting 50% tariffs on Indian exports to the United States. India is the single largest purchaser of Russian oil. It goes back and forth between India and China, who is the largest purchaser, but the Indians are the largest purchaser, and they are now suffering 50% tariffs on anything they try to sell to the United States because they buy Russian oil. Either Putin comes to the table and negotiates a ceasefire, or sanctions stay in effect. To get out of crippling secondary tariffs, India and potentially China have a choice: stop buying Russian oil and gas, or demand that Putin negotiate an end to the war with Ukraine. With a ceasefire or an armistice, the European-led coalition of the willing that I mentioned a minute ago, with support from the United States, can deploy forces into Ukraine, on the ground in Ukraine, to enforce the ceasefire and stand behind the Ukrainian military as you defend your borders and the ceasefire line. The European Union can continue to lead the support effort and should use the $300 billion in frozen Russian assets now sitting in European banks to pay for those weapons and to reconstruct your country. These funds should go to Ukraine so that for the next 3 years, that $300 billion, you will have funds to purchase those weapons, to defend yourselves, and to rebuild. With a ceasefire or armistice in place, Ukraine can continue on its path to the European Union and to NATO. You can resume normal democratic activities, political debate, freedom of the press, elections. You can continue to strengthen your military with NATO-compatible formations and Western weapons from NATO nations, including the United States. In my view, Ukraine should be in NATO. The security provided by the European-led coalition of the willing is a good start. But a more effective, tested, and experienced military force designed specifically to deter Russians is NATO. With a ceasefire or armistice in place and a security guarantee to deter further Russian aggression, negotiations toward a long-term settlement could begin. I'm not optimistic that such negotiations would be successful. Ukraine demands sovereignty, return of occupied territory, accountability for Russian war crimes, compensation for war damage, the return of all children, prisoners of war, civilians held in Russia. Putin, on the other hand, demands occupied Ukrainian territories, neutrality, disarmament. The Russian demands are so unrealistic and unacceptable to Ukraine and its allies that I don't see an agreement. There might, however, be a useful historical precedent. The two Koreas have never been able to agree on a formal peace treaty. They have an armistice. But that has not kept the South Koreans from developing their own democracy and economy and entering into a binding security agreement with the United States. Ukraine could do something like that. I am sure that Ukraine will never give up legal claim to all its territory, as defined by your internationally recognized 1991 borders. Ukraine might reluctantly agree, for now, temporarily, as West Germany did after World War II, that it will not use military force to push the Russians out of the 19% of Ukrainian land that they now illegally occupy. Like the West Germans then, Ukrainians are convinced that they will someday reclaim all their territory. Till that time, no one should recognize Russia's illegal claim to Ukrainian land. This American, like most Americans, has enormous respect for Ukraine and Ukrainians. You have earned the admiration of my country and other Western nations. You have earned your place in the European Union and in NATO. You have defended your right to live and thrive independently, free from threats from your neighbor. I am convinced that you will prevail. Thank you very much.